Hello everyone, I welcome you to CEC lecture series. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitree College, Delhi University, and this lecture is the second lecture or one would say that a continuation of the lecture which is titled Wallace Stevens, a Modernist Poet. This lecture is part of the ongoing series on the 20th century English poetry. Now, in the previous part or the first part, we had looked at the background of poet Wallace Stevens. We said that how he's a American modernist, and while he is part of this literary movement, but we also notice certain departures in his style of writing from the traditional conventions of literary modernism. Now, imagism, which is a which is a sub movement of modernism, also is crucial to understanding Wallace Stevens' poetry, whereby we notice a use of direct and sharp images in such poems, which are also incredibly descriptive, and they create a very a distinct visual experience for the reader. And the third thing that we had said was that there's also a very pronounced or a significant philosophical element to his poetry as well, right? So these are some of the points broadly that we had talked about in the first part. Now here in this part of the lecture, let us look at a poem titled The Snowman, which was written by Wallace Stevens in his first poetry collection titled Harmonium in 1923. So this is one of his early poems where we are also able to notice Wallace Stevens as a poet of imagism. Right? Now let us look at the first two stanzas of the poem and then see what they mean. And I quote, "One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow." I repeat, one must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time, to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter. Now, here in the first two stanzas, the foremost thing that captures our attention is that the poet is presenting to us a scene from extreme winter, right? Now, we notice reference to the spruce or the juniper. All these are conifer trees, which are noticed to to be present in incredibly cold places. So we see that that is where Wallace Stevens has set this particular poem of his. So the poet, as we say, evokes very sharp images to create the atmosphere of winter. We notice the word frost. He uses the phrase pine trees crusted with snow. Now you see, if you look at this second phrase, pine trees crusted with snow. Now the word crusted tells you that what a sharp image it is. And once again, remember that he is an imagist poet. So crusted with snow would mean that there are crusts, there are multiple layers of snow which have been formed on pine trees. A crust, which is the outer surface, right, which sometimes is also brittle. Perhaps the snow is fresh, right? So pine trees are crusted with snow and junipers are shagged with ice. Now the word shagged, once again, is also very important. Why? Because it means destroyed. So junipers appear to be, which are also so full of snow and frost, appear to be in a poor condition because of such extreme weather. So you see these very sharp and clear and direct images then bring out a sense of the ice cold weather. Now, second, we say that not only are the junipers shagged or damaged, we also see that Stevens says that the spruces, they appear rough. So there is something particularly harsh about the winter. It is not a usual winter that perhaps maybe that everyone is aware of. So these images particularly then create this sense. Now, having established this image of extreme cold, or one would say the raw cold, he comes to the second very important point. He says, for one to appreciate such winter, and I quote, he says, one must have a mind of winter to regard the frost, unquote. Now you might wonder, what do we mean by one must have a mind of winter to regard the frost? Once again, remember what we had discussed, that there is a very important philosophical element to his poetry. So he says that if we are to really understand or appreciate such extreme winter, which has crusts of snow, which has the trees, the conifers that are destroyed by snow. If we are to really appreciate such winter, one must have a mind of winter. Mind of winter would mean what? That could perhaps mean that one must be open to appreciating everything or every aspect of existence or experience, right? If something is challenging, if something involves struggle, which perhaps is the sense that is created through this bitter cold, of course there's no warmth, there's no comfort, but there is roughness, there is the trees are shagged, etc. So even if there is such a scenario, he says one must have a mind of winter in order to regard it, right? So he doesn't wish us to disregard or completely dismiss such a landscape as maybe one can say uninhabitable, etc. But there is something to this landscape as well, which is frosty, which is extremely cold, which is extremely I would say devoid of any kind of warmth. For Wallace Stevens, there is still something even in this for us to appreciate. That's why he says one must have a mind of winter to regard the frost. Right? Now, to just help you further unpack what could he be saying in these two stanzas, is that we of course notice that there is hidden here a philosophical rumination. So while on the surface it seems to be a scene from winter where it's extreme cold, he is describing conifers that are full of snow and which are shagged, which are damaged, which are rough, etc. But then what is he trying to say beyond that? Having understood the surface meaning, what do you think is the poet trying to point towards? Is that all? Of course not, right? So one may say that perhaps the winter could mean hardship, could mean struggle, could also mean old age, right? So these are the possible I would say meanings of the winter that Wallace Stevens represents in the poem. So this, in fact, the entire scene as he portrays, it evokes a sense of lack of growth and stagnation. There are crusts of frost, the trees are bare, they are damaged, there's of course no leaf, there's a sense of emptiness. So what do we notice? There's a scene which is, which evokes a sense of lack of growth and also to an extent stagnation, right? Now you see, having evoked these senses, but it's so wonderful to notice that the attitude of the poet is not pessimistic, right? That's where I would say, the beauty of this poet lies. That even as the images might appear on the surface to be negative, pointing towards hardship, struggle, etc., but the attitude is not pessimistic. He says that the focus in the first two stanzas is on the mind or the attitude during such times, right? And so, as he says, the frost has its own significance in the circle of life, as if that's what the poet wants to say when he says that the mind, we need to have a mind of winter in order to regard the snow. Perhaps what he means to say is that while yes, there is struggle, there are such times in life where there seems to be no growth, no warmth, no hope, etc. But at the same time, such a phase or such an experience, or one can say such a season, the winter season, has its own significance in the larger circle of life. Only the need is for one to have the right approach and give, even the quote-unquote frost, as Wallace Stevens says, its due. So, which means even the hardships, even the lack, even the phases of lack of growth, have something for us to learn from, right? So, this is the idea that Wallace Stevens evokes in the first two stanzas, where he draws a very sharp picture of an extreme cold winter night. Now let's move to the next stanzas and see what the poet says there. Now this is in fact in continuation of the first stanza itself, where he says that the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place. For the listener who listens in the snow and nothing himself beholds, nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. Now you see, these are the last two stanzas of the poem. It's a very short poem, but of course has lots to convey. Now here he talks about the January sun. Now, what does the January sun look like? It's of course very different from maybe sun of the summer, where it's very sharp, it's full of warmth, but January sun is very weak, right? The rays are not very, I would say, bright. So if at all there's sun, it's a January sun. And not to think of any misery, he says, in the sound of the wind. Now the landscape is such that there's snow, there's frost all around, and one can also hear the sound of the wind. Now you see, the moment we talk about the sound of the wind, where is it that you're able to hear the sound of the wind? When there is emptiness around, where there is silence around. So once again, even the reference to the sound of the wind then contributes to the dreariness of the landscape that he presents here. So he says that, but not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves. So he says that the wind might be howling, we might be able to hear the wind. The leaves might be very few, as he says, in the sound of the few leaves. The leaves are very few, but he says that we must not think of misery, right? So once again, he is reinstating, this is the beauty, that on the one hand, he portrays or represents such a dreary landscape, but on the other, he does not let you slip into hopelessness. He says, do not think of misery when you hear the sound or when you see very few leaves. No, right? He says, why? Because this is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place. Indicating what? That the place is bare. Bare why? Because you have conifers that are not full of green leaves, and there's emptiness, right? Even as the place is bare, the wind is howling. But at the same time, he says, let's not read misery into it. He says, for the listener then, who listens in the snow. Now, there is a listener who's standing in the middle of such a frosty day. He listens carefully. It says he listens in the snow, where there's nothing but snow around, and nothing himself beholds, nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. Now, you see, it's important for us to spend some time over the last few sentences, which we will do in just a bit. But what we say is that, in these last two stanzas, Wallace Stevens, in a way, reinforces the idea which is introduced in the beginning. So, what does he say? First, that one should not associate sadness with the harsh winter wind. Second, we notice that the landscape is bleak, with no hope of newness, just a cold existence, where the leaves are few and the land is bare. Yet, the poet says, it does not warrant the individual to associate the emotion of sorrow with the dreary wind. So, even as that frostiness of the landscape continues in the last two stanzas as well, but he says that we must not leave hope, but we must not keep in mind a sense of sadness, because while the landscape might be bleak, but there is something in the poet that wants us to acknowledge that this bleakness or this emptiness or this lack of growth is only part of a larger process. Perhaps that is what the poet is trying to emphasize when he constantly reaffirms that we must not read misery into it. And then, towards the end, we see that the poet says that the individual has to refrain from imagining or assuming situations that are not right in front of him. As he says, and I quote, the listener nothing himself beholds. Now, the observer, so what does it mean that the listener nothing himself beholds? It means that the observer does not assume which is not there. Once again, this seems to be poet's way of cautioning the reader, or for that matter the person in such a circumstance, that do not visualize something which is not there. As he said, the listener nothing himself beholds. Himself beholds means creating, let's say, maybe a vision or a visual which is actually not there. So he says that do not, because mind has a tendency of going into an overdrive in such a situation where, when you notice such stagnation, mind has a sense of or has a tendency of slipping into that kind of a misery, gloominess, etc. But he says, no, you should not behold something which is not there, right? So, so that is what means by the listener nothing himself beholds. The next thing we see is that, the landscape is characterized by this nothingness, right? The landscape which is characterized by nothingness is the reality he confronts while he assumes nothing. So, the poet says, and the nothing that is, which means that on the one hand, the listener or the onlooker must not visualize something which does not exist, and secondly, the current landscape also is characterized by nothingness, but the reader, the listener must confront it as it is, right? So once again, what do we notice? A word of strength during adversity. And where do we see this? Very directly in this sentence where Wallace Stevens says, not to think of any misery, unquote. He very clearly cautions, do not think of any misery. And once again, we notice that there is also a philosophical rumination on nothingness. You see, nothing also is repeated in the last two sentences of the poem. It indicates a lack of activity, an emptiness, an absence. And this emptiness, for Wallace Stevens, is also a kind of a presence. You see, look at the, I would say, the paradox here. That while there is emptiness, while there is nothingness, and yet there is also a presence. Because what does he say? Nothing that is. Right? So, is talks about existence. He says nothing that is. So, even nothingness or the state of emptiness also is a kind of presence. I know these are philosophical thoughts, might take us a while to kind of get used to them, but that is exactly where the master or the master craft of Wallace Stevens lies. So we can say that when he uses the phrase nothing that is, we notice that even an absence is the existence of something. For that matter, it seems to be the case that the poet wants to say that the acknowledgement of nothingness also indicates some sort of an activity. So therefore, through this we notice that the poet affirms a positive outlook even where it is the most difficult, or for that matter the most impossible. So also if you now look at this poem from once again the point of view of the modernist trend, we see that Wallace Stevens again to an extent does subscribe to this trend. At the same time, he also departs from it. Now, where do we see him subscribing to the trend? In the kind of landscape that he creates. It is frosty, it's cold, there's no growth, there's no abundance, there's a weak sun, there's hollowness. All these are I would say the experiences of the individual in the modern times, right? So the way or the kind of landscape that he actually creates in the poem resonates or echoes the modernist sensibility, right? But at the same time, that sensibility coexists with a sense of affirmation, right? With a sense of optimism that the poet very clearly establishes in the poem, where he says that yes, there might be frost, but we need a mind to regard it. There might be wind blowing, which is to an extent horrifying. There might be very few leaves that are making this sound. He says, but do not read misery into it, right? So it seems to be the case that he wants to reaffirm that this also is part of the larger cycle, of a larger structure. This is also just a phase, right? So that's how we and by the way, in most modernist texts, the sense of optimism would actually be missing. But here we notice Wallace Stevens, reinforce that sense of optimism. So we see at the level of the theme, then Wallace Stevens, on the one hand, subscribes to modernism, evoking its sense of values, its central values. At the same time, he also departs from it. And second, we also noticed when we were discussing the words, the phrases, the kind of sharp images that Stevens uses in this poem. They make it is almost like the landscape comes alive in front of the reader, or in front of the reader's eyes. So once again, indicating what? Imagism, or establishing Wallace Stevens as an imagist poet. And third, when he talks about nothingness, there is a very important, or this very significant amount of space and devoted to nothingness, and we also see a repetition of the word, right? So on the one hand, nothingness might seem to be pointing towards something which is some kind of an absence, or some kind of an NOI, etc., some kind of an emptiness. But at the same time, Wallace Stevens has a very different approach to it. He says that there is nothingness, but that nothingness also is one kind of existence. It is one flavor of existence. So even absence, in a sense, is the existence, because you are thinking about it. If your thought goes to it, it means it exists. Even as it might not be visible materially, it may not be, you may not be able to touch it. But the fact that you're thinking about it, you're considering it, itself brings it into existence, right? So we notice that he therefore brings out this idea of being, nothingness, and existence. So in this very short and sweet poem, so much is evoked by Wallace Stevens. So I hope that through this discussion of this one of his early poems, you get a flavor of what kind of a poet Wallace Stevens was, and all the points that we had discussed about his poetic craft, we saw that being applied in this particular poem of his. And in fact, I would also urge you next to read the poem The Ice Cream Man, which is also which if read along with the Snowman is going to make a very good combination for us to appreciate the poetry of Wallace Stevens. Thank you.